So today we're going to discuss another example, and unfortunately there are many, but today we're going to be discussing just another example of the typical abusive harm and illegal harassment that's been conducted by Washington State's Attorney General Bob Ferguson in his ongoing, never-ending weaponization of the state's Attorney General office in a way that's never been seen before in state history. Now, in today's most recent example, we're going to discuss Bob Ferguson's targeted legal harassment directed at two pro-life organizations and their vendors that were targeted exclusively for the reason that Bob Ferguson politically disagreed with their pro-life stance. And, as has been custom for him, used the broad excuse of Washington State's Consumer Protection Act as his theoretical justification used to destroy or attempt to destroy their nonprofit organizations, and fortunately his failed effort then to destroy their ability to exist. Now, this is just one recent example in a long and repetitive history of Washington State's Attorney General Bob Ferguson and his kind of relentless abuse of his position as Attorney General to target his perceived political enemies or opponents. In addition to targeting perceived political opponents with whom he disagrees, he also uses his weaponization of the taxpayer-funded Attorney General's office through lawsuits mainly as a way to personally fundraise for his own political campaigns using quotes from the very same press releases that he drafts and approves to justify his attacks on his political opposition in the first place. Now, he's actually done this for many years now, and many of our videos are going to repeatedly document the examples of how his office has abused the state's ethics laws, which, ignored as much as they are, as kind of part of his political campaign fundraising process. Now, in this example that we're talking about today, Washington State Democrat Attorney General Bob Ferguson in May of 2022 targeted two Washington State faith-based nonprofits called Obria Group and My Choices, which was doing business as Obria Medical Group's Pacific Northwest, with extensive, illegal, and invasive civil investigation demands as kind of part of a politically motivated investigation that lasted, it's actually 2 years now, but it's lasted for almost 18 months, which, among other things, illegally demanded 13 years of privileged communications, documents, etc., in an effort to kind of troll for another imaginary crime that he could maybe invent to destroy these organizations, which is something Bob Ferguson has repeatedly done to others in the past. He also used this excuse to harass their vendors in an effort to increase confusion, scare away some of their vendors, and perhaps increase their costs of operation. In fact, Ferguson didn't even have a formal complaint against the organizations, or at least not one that he publicized, and essentially he was just using taxpayer resources to harass and intimidate these organizations and their vendors to see if he could just invent some excuse to kind of shift this investigation into some type of trumped-up lawsuit. Where have we seen that before? Now, he's done this so frequently, actually, it's just reflexive and it's habitual for him now. Eventually, these organizations were represented by the Alliance Defending Freedom, who filed a federal suit against Bob Ferguson's office late last year in November. And I'll actually link to the legal document down below in the video description. This case was a clear example of political intimidation and abuse of the First Amendment rights of these organizations. Even without formal litigation, Bob Ferguson knew that he could use taxpayer funds to destroy perceived political opponents of his simply by turning a phony investigation itself into just costly punishment, where the process itself is the punishment. One of Bob Ferguson's more bizarre claims in this case was, and he eventually got here, which is that, hey, my abuse of public resources in an effort to troll perceived political opponents that Bob didn't like, but, listen, hey, it caused no harm to them, right, to his political targets. However, when they were able to demonstrate how much the harassment strategy of the Attorney General's office under Ferguson's kind of politicized weaponization actually did cause them to lose their insurance policy, and then it ultimately increased their insurance costs by 7 times what they had previously paid for the exact same coverage. This was just one example of the abusive results. Bob Ferguson's office suddenly went silent. In fact, with the recent unanimous decision against the U.S. Supreme Court, actually, against New York and the NRA case that came down just last week, the writing was clearly on the wall, and Bob Ferguson was forced to back down and ultimately abandon his targeted, politicized harassment campaign against these two pro-life organizations. Now, there are many examples like this of Bob Ferguson repeatedly weaponizing his office to harass his perceived political opponents, often for fundraising benefits and to help him in his future election campaign. In this ongoing attempt to run for Washington state governor position right now, which he's involved in, it is no surprise that he's endorsed by the abortion lobby and the related organizations that also hate and oppose these very same pro-life groups and efforts, and of course these organizations here in Washington state. So it's far easier for Bob Ferguson then and for these organizations to justify their campaign contributions to him and his political campaign when he can just prove that he's willing to use the power of the state to damage their political opponents, particularly when those same political opponents have done nothing wrong. This is a perfect fundraising tool for Bob Ferguson, and he used it for that. Now, clearly, this history of abusing his position as Attorney General merely whetted the appetite of Bob Ferguson, the man who would become king, or governor in this case, and he clearly plans to continue his abusive ways if the voters of Washington state make the horrific mistake of choosing him as the next governor. Now, the tales of Bob Ferguson's tyranny are endless, and the victims are many, and we will continue to tell their stories of abuse for as long as we can remain uncensored on YouTube and elsewhere on the internet. The traditional tamed local media, they're always going to cover up the abuses of government and probably Bob Ferguson, but we will not. So let me begin to close with just a quote from the attorney who was representing Obria and the pro-life organizations targeted by Bob Ferguson's weaponization of his office. And here's a quote, starting now. Quote, "The U.S. Constitution protects Obria Group and Obria Medical Group Pacific Northwest's right to freely speak their beliefs, freely exercise their faith, freely associate with like-minded individuals and organizations, and continue to provide services in a caring and compassionate environment to women and men facing difficult pregnancy circumstances," said ADF Senior Counsel Tim Garrison. And he goes on to say, quote, "Our clients have already expended exorbitant time and financial resources trying to comply with the unreasonable demands made by Washington State's Attorney General, and we urge the court to swiftly halt this unlawful actions." Now, that's end quote. Since the case was filed by the Alliance Defending Freedom, and it was in federal court, not in Washington State's, unfortunately, openly corrupted state court system, where, unfortunately, even more, most judges are all appointed by Democratic governors with clear and unambiguous alignment politically, not, of course, to the state constitution as it should be, but to the Democratic Party's kind of political power base. So it must have become obvious to Bob Ferguson that he was going to lose this case, and that unlike most of his targeted victims, these organizations now had effective legal representation that could go the legal distance in federal court, where Bob Ferguson has far less political influence over the judges. Now, in a recent unusual step, Bob Ferguson was forced to back down and abandon the harassment campaign that he had started. His letter dated May 23, 2024 stated, and I quote, "As you are aware, the Consumer Protection Division does not issue formal notice to a target when it closes an investigation. We are making an exception in this instance to provide your clients with a statement that they can offer to their insurer, which will provide certainty as to the status of this investigation. Accordingly, this letter is to inform you that the division closed its investigation into the potential Consumer Protection Act violations set forth in the May 19, 2022 Civil Investigative Demands, the CIDs, issued to Obria Group and Obria Medical Clinics Pacific Northwest, and in related third-party CIDs issued in 2022 to certain of Obria's vendors. No further response to the CIDs or those issued to Obria's vendors are necessary." Now, it wasn't really Ferguson's choice here to stop this harassment campaign, but he saw the inevitable writing on the wall, or in federal court in this case, to be more specific, and he stopped the harassment for this group. Now, his personal vendettas against many others continue to rage unchecked, even now. And we will be discussing, I think, more of these cases very soon. So this story, of course, does have a better ending than most stories about Bob Ferguson because the targets of his abuse survived the onslaught. Most of those unlawfully targeted by Bob Ferguson, they don't survive because they just don't have the resources to adequately fight back. And Washington State's judges and court system's politically corrupted right now. However, there are some lessons that can be learned here. First, you can't prevail against bullies like Bob Ferguson by sitting back and then trying to comply with their abusive demands. A bully is never satisfied, and they always continue to abuse their victims as long as they believe they can get away with it. Like any abuser, Bob Ferguson only backs down when he realizes that he might lose. If more of his victims were able to be capable of pushing back and resisting the abuser like they were in this case, then we would actually see far fewer future victims. Now, secondly, we all should care about cases like this. You may not be a pro-life person, and you may disagree with their political and religious beliefs, but even then, you should recognize that if an abuser and a tyrant like Bob Ferguson is allowed to get away with this type of abuse on others, eventually he's going to get around to abusing you or somebody that you do care about. We can only stop abusers like Bob Ferguson if we stand up and show up, and then, of course, stand up for the victims of his campaigns of abuse. There are many victims of Bob Ferguson out there. We can only help them if we're willing to show up, share their stories, and then make sure everybody knows about why we don't want an abuser like Bob Ferguson in the governor's mansion. Today, he may be threatening to imprison his political enemies and others who seem distant to you, but nothing will prevent him from doing the exact same thing to you next. This is why we care about liberty and freedom for everyone, not just ourselves. This is why we must stand against abusers and tyrants in order to make a better future for others. We have to be willing to show up, because the future inevitably belongs to those who show up.